Welcome to Green and Red, Scrappy Politics for Scrappy People, a regular podcast on radical environmental and anti-capitalist politics, brought to you by Bob Bazanko and Scott Parkin.
Welcome to the silky smooth sounds of the Green and Red podcast. I'm your co-host, Scott Parkin, in Berkeley, California today. Bob is off on assignment on this Martin Luther King day / sad day that we're calling Inauguration Day. But we're going to be talking about the next phase of all of our lives in this point in history. We've been doing a series, we're starting to do a series on climate in the age of Trump. And so today we're going to be talking a bit about Trump and climate and corporate campaigning and bank campaigning. Joining me today is Liv Senghor, who is an artist and an activist with a history in nonviolent direct action. Liv has had a career that has spanned entertainment and activism, and actually earned a Peabody and an Emmy for her work on Netflix's Patriot Act with Hasan Minhaj. Since 2014, Liv has been a dedicated organizer against police brutality and U.S. militarism. And then last summer, during the summer of heat, Liv joined Stop the Money Pipeline and has led many actions, has been arrested for engaging in civil disobedience 15 times. She's now Stop the Money Pipeline, or STOMP, because you'll probably hear us say STOMP a couple times today, New York action and campaign manager, and an active organizer with Planet Over Profits. Welcome to the Green and Red podcast, Liv.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
And just a little background for what we're about to talk about. We're obviously seeing more and more climate disasters. The most recent horrific episode has been in Los Angeles, where we've seen the fires. Somewhat inspired us to start this series around climate in the age of Trump. But we've also been seeing this drive by the right around anti-ESG stuff that the banks and other corporations have been doing. Texas and West Virginia have passed anti-ESG laws. And we're also seeing the banks recently pulling out of things like the Net Zero Bank Alliance, which in the New York Times today, they actually reported was as a precautionary measure to prevent them from being sued by anti-ESG forces. And so maybe we could start with that, talk about bank backtracking a little bit. Maybe we'll start off with that for people who aren't as familiar with this. Could you give us a little bit of an update on the status of some of these big Wall Street banks pulling back on their commitments on fossil fuels, the climate crisis, et cetera?
Yes, of course. So the Net Zero Banking Alliance was basically a formal sort of show of commitment for some of these big banks to promise to divest from fossil fuel projects, especially expansion and other money that they're providing for these dirty, polluting industries. The idea was originally, which had been significantly watered down, to create a banking system that is net zero, so that's not funding or causing increased emissions.
Like zero carbon emissions, right?
Zero carbon emissions, yeah.
Yeah.
And it is unsurprising, but quite disappointing to see so many pulling out. One of our main campaigns at STOMP, or Stop the Money Pipeline, has been against Citibank for their funding of fossil fuel expansion projects. They've poured almost $400 billion into these new fossil fuel projects since the Paris agreements. And we had been pushing them as this publicly facing, they're very sustainable and progressive when it comes to a lot of the big banks. But to see even them pulling out publicly of the Net Zero Banking Alliance was definitely disturbing and shows a backtracking in a lot of these commitments. And I think, like you mentioned, a fear of the push and the swell of activism that has come to them in particular, but all of these banks collectively. I think that the legal sort of side of the battle hadn't quite been begun yet, especially from the activists' front. And so it's definitely disheartening to see that being foreseen by the banks already as an avenue that they want to avoid. And there was some talk and debate up in the air within our coalition of whether or not this was something that we were going to specifically take up with them. But there's also the argument that this $400 billion had been spent, at least by Citi, already with them in the net zero banking alliance. So whether or not it was a performative pledge to begin with is, I think, worth also bringing up.
And when we're Paris, I believe, was in December of 2015.
Yeah.
And so they've put, and Citibank alone has put $400 billion into new fossil fuel projects. And when we're talking like new fossil fuel projects, we're talking about pipelines and infrastructure, like export facilities on the Gulf Coast for liquefied natural gas, things like that.
Yeah, exactly. I think the total amount that banks had been putting in was well over $700 billion.
Of all the banks.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. And there's also there's a history of successful campaigns to get the banks to drop some of these big projects. One that comes to mind is Dakota Access Pipeline, the sort of the primary banks, which have been funding DAPL, actually moved away from the oil company that was building it, Oil Energy Transfer Partners. And so there's also a record of success related to finance and bank campaigning on these projects as well, correct?
Yes. Yeah, that's correct. There has also been sort of small victories along the way. So with Citi in particular, Citi pledged not to fund any expansion projects or new fossil fuel projects, specifically LNGs, in the Amazon last summer. So it was a quiet announcement, but pushes to the banking industry have been successful incrementally. The problem being that we just don't have enough time to continue these very small pledges and very small incremental changes.
Right. I mean, when we see what happened in Los Angeles or what happened in Western North Carolina back in the fall, it's climate change is here. And
exactly,
the carbon cycle is getting out of control. So
yes. Yeah, exactly. And it's the fear obviously is also that on a federal level, any restrictions on offshore drilling will likely be completely rolled back under Trump by executive order. We're also expecting limitations to clean energy like offshore wind farms for some reason. It's something that he's been very adamant about on the campaign trail. So another one of our demands for these banks is often
it's because it's killing the whales, is what he said.
Killing the whales. He cares very much about the whales. I forgot.
I think it has more to do with windmill farms messing up his golf course in Scotland or something.
Oh,
I'm sure it has something to do with him making money.
Oh, facts, definitely. I remember him being very angry at how loud windmills were at some point.
The other reason he talks about a lot is bird strike, about how it's killing the bird populations.
Naturally. Another thing that he cares deeply about, clearly.
Yeah, probably as we sit here, he's probably writing some of those he's signing those executive orders, rolling back.
Probably, yeah. Yeah, exactly. And that's going to also, I think, embolden a lot of banks to fund more fossil fuel projects. And prior to the election, and we've also anticipated a lack of regulation of financial industry, period. It's definitely concerning. But it hasn't changed any of our campaign goals.
That's great. The anti-ESG, I call them the anti-ESG forces, have, in the New York Times, like in the New York Times, they said the banks were afraid of possible lawsuits. Yep. When we're talking about these anti-ESG forces, who are we talking about?
It's a pretty wide sort of net. There are obviously individual organizations who are pushing this. There is business interests who are pushing anti-ESG interests, many of which also have some sort of stake in fossil fuels or other sort of dirty industries. We have, who else? I mean,
members of Congress talk it up a lot. So Republican members of Congress.
Congress members. That's true on the federal and state levels as well. And I think, if I'm correct, also members of these GOP interest groups like Heritage Foundation people also support anti-ESG legislation. And I think when you look at a lot of, at least the legislators, and certainly on the federal level, a lot of them do, frankly, have some sort of stake in fossil fuels, and usually that's financial. So I would say that corporate interests are a really big driver. Not the only driver, but a huge, I would argue, outsized driver of the anti-ESG movement.
Yeah, it seems like they're feeling emboldened right now as Trump took his re-inauguration oath today. So speaking of Trump and some of these corporations, corporate influencers, corporate power, environmental movements saw Trump as an unmovable object when it came to environmental and climate campaigning. And so we saw this bigger shift towards corporate campaigning, towards bank campaigning. Seems like every organization I know who had never done a bank campaign then all of a sudden had a bank campaign, both within the environmental space and outside of the environmental space.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that. Is that going to be happening in 2025? One, we're seeing this bigger capitulation of what I would call the left and progressive political space to Trump, because he's being seen as much more of the status quo versus where he wasn't in 2017. But do you think we'll see more corporate campaigning as a result of Trump coming back into office?
Short answer, yes, I do think so. We've seen a lot of our coalition partners, especially those who had been at all involved in specifically federal legislation or regulation or anything, they'll take a step back from that and focus a little bit more on private companies. But yes, we're definitely seeing increased banking campaigns, increased private equity and private asset manager campaign as well. And I think the difference this time is that there is also a very concerted effort to focus on blue state laws. In New York and California in particular, there's a lot of these sort of legislation trackers that we've been compiling, Colorado as well, and Washington State, where we're trying to look at all of the legislation that has been passed or proposed that either encourages investment in clean energy or expansion of clean energy or regulation of the fossil fuel industry and or banks. Specifically, they're investing in fossil fuels. And the idea is to build these sort of havens of progressive climate policy that hopefully could then spread to other states. I think New York and California probably have the most influence in that aspect. So I think in addition to trying to push private companies, there is more of a localized political effort this time around as well. And hoping that certainly New York and California were seen as these pillars of resistance to Trump his last term. So we are also hoping to see that again.
I've definitely been getting that sense from a number of blue states, California, New York, Illinois.
Yeah.
And then the other part is that Trump has been casting himself to be at odds with those governors as well. It seems like particularly lately, maybe because it's over Los Angeles, but Gavin Newsom in particular.
Yes. Yeah. It seems like there's definitely a narrative building where these progressive governors are not able to protect the people or not able to run the state. And all these states are in decline. And I think the worry is in New York, we've been very closely watching Kathy Hochul to see whether or not she tries to align a little bit more with Trump and his policies or distances herself, which is yet to be seen.
I think you first got involved with Stop the Money Pipeline as a fellow during Summer of Heat last summer. We did a couple short episodes, I think, with Alec, who also worked for Stop the Money Pipeline, and Alice, who works with New York Communities of Change. I was actually on the ground for one of the weeks for Summer of Heat. Did some on-the-spot interviews with them. But could you actually remind our audience what Summer of Heat was? The first one.
Yeah. Summer of Heat 2024 was the Summer of Heat on Wall Street. And it was a 12-week-long nonviolent direct action campaign targeting the financial enablers of climate change. Our main target was Citibank, and we had a huge campaign with demands for them to stop investing in fossil fuel expansion, move some of that money into renewables, make sure to respect Indigenous sovereignty and free, prior, and informed consent, and to divest in terms of like their investments from fossil fuels companies. And it was, I believe, the longest direct action climate campaign in US history. It was nonstop, and it was quite frankly exhausting, but it was really amazing to watch so many people brought into the movement through this campaign in particular, who are still very much active and have even become leaders in their organizations and groups. And it was also very interesting to watch how direct action tactically can be used against some of these private companies. Citibank, we developed this very odd relationship with Citibank security and the workers and the leadership, specifically Val Smith and Jane Fraser. Val Smith's the head of sustainability, and Jane Fraser's the president of Citi. And it was interesting to watch them adapt to what we were doing, to have to form this escalation arc, to collaborate with other groups who had campaigns against Wall Street in general or Citi in particular. And what we really hope to do is to continue an escalation arc and to continue a campaign and see what the power of sustained direct action is currently in the 21st century. We know that this works. We've seen this time and time again. We've seen it with Vietnam War protests, civil rights movement, suffrage, that sustained pressure in the form of direct action does work to move targets. So that was the ethos behind it, revive that spirit here in the US.
Right. Yeah. And this, to me, direct action, a part of it is disruption of your opponent, disrupt the status quo. I think King even, that's what King even talked about during, I think in the letter from the Birmingham jail.
Yes.
So
yeah.
to see that disruption happen at the sort of, at the front door of some of the biggest corporate players in the world, I think was very powerful and very admirable on all of y'all's part for doing that.
Oh, thank you.
And then there is going to be a Summer of Heat 2, correct?
Yes. Yeah. Summer of Heat 2.0.
2.0.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. We, this time we really want to continue the escalation arc, both in terms of tactics, but also in terms of scope. It was because it was Wall Street last year. It was very New York focused. New York was the epicenter. And there was a huge power in taking on financial targets in New York, because we had all of these banks and insurance companies and private asset managers who have their headquarters right here. And it's fairly convenient. And we wanted to have those financial targets remain the same. It would obviously not be a great direct action campaign to do one summer for one financial target and then move on. But we do want to also embolden and enable other cities where they have enormous power based on their locality to take action in their own way as well. So we have, it's also still in the works, but we have eyes on California with the tech sector centralized out there, and also with climate disaster being very top of mind for a lot of folks in California in particular, as a potential Summer of Heat center for this year. And we also were talking with a lot of our partners in Texas. We have folks at Texas Campaign for the Environment and the Vessel Project who came up to New York for Summer of Heat in 2024. And it was an absolutely incredible week of actions. We centered our Gulf South solidarity. Citibank in particular has funded LNG projects in the Gulf South, really like truly in the backyards of some of these communities, which I just found absolutely appalling, like how close and how affected they were by these. But they turned out, we had a fantastic week.
That was the week I was there, was the Gulf South.
Oh, the Gulf South week.
Yeah.
That was one of my favorite weeks. But it was really amazing. And there's so much interest down there of continuing that campaign and also launching sort of their own pressure campaigns And obviously in a red state, direct action is very different, especially Texas. Yeah, exactly. What's great about this partnership is it also enables, when we get folks to come up here, they're able to do direct action and experience the different tactics and everything in a way that is a lot, to be honest, like safer and a lot less risky for them down there. And I think this year there's a lot of interest in seeing what can be done in terms of escalation in Texas. So with that sort of three-pronged hub model is what we hope for Summer of Heat 2025 to become.
That sounds fantastic.
Yeah, it's very exciting.
I think for when some of the Gulf South stuff will be happening, I'll be down there for part of it. I'm actually from Texas, and from Houston, and my co-host who's not here, Bob, is a professor at the University of Houston, also lives in Houston for part of the year.
Oh, wow. Oh, that'll be amazing. Yeah.
Yeah. My only last question, I just thought of this, is that you also work with People Over Planet. Excuse me.
Planet Over Profit.
Planet Over Profit. Sorry. People Over Planet. That's bad. And which does a lot of disruption and confrontation with corporate types. Has there been any sort of shift in any of your strategies around that based on Trump coming in, or even the Luigi Mangione and Brian Thompson story, or anything like that?
Yeah, definitely. That's a great question. We, Planet Over Profit, or POP, we're youth-led, anti-capitalist, and very focused on naming the enablers of climate change, which is billionaires. And already, I think the report came out like a couple days ago that already in the first 2 weeks of the year, billionaires had contributed a year's worth of emissions for an average person. So their consumption and their output is extremely outsized. And our ethos is very much to name and shame them and make them the villains of the climate story. We have definitely noticed a bit of a shift in how we're perceived, the general ethos. First of all, with the Trump election, there's such a huge drive for young people to join an organization or to organize in some way. We have been experiencing an influx in new membership and an interest in influx in interest for direct action specifically. And we're very much working on expanding our capacity so that we're able to train more people in the city and hopefully beyond to be able to take direct action, specifically against these billionaires and elites. And also we are working on making our narrative even more accessible for people, right? So with Luigi Mangione, for instance, we saw that there really wasn't much sympathy out there for billionaires. And we obviously our actions are bird dogs and disruptions. So if there's a billionaire speaking at a conference, then we're going to go and we're going to shame them for their climate crimes. And making our actions really surrounded not only just, we're very reactionary in that aspect, right? We're waiting for a billionaire to come speak here. We're waiting for some sort of event or panel where we know they're going to be to go and disrupt. And we are looking at becoming a little bit more proactive in terms of getting the messaging out to everyday people that how much do billionaires really emit in terms of their output and their carbon emissions? How much do billionaires hoard wealth that could be used to fund communities? How much are billionaires responsible for how expensive everything is right now and for housing? And we want to create a little bit more of that kind of messaging and to focus on more actions that are about the wealthy as this group of people who are driving climate change, and the fact that us as people, as community members, have a right to a certain quality of life that we are just not getting right now. And just making that more of a central message through our actions is definitely going to be a cornerstone of all of our campaigns coming up next year, which we will be working a lot with during Summer of Heat.
Yeah, that sounds great. Yeah, because
Yeah.
also Planet Over Profit's a partner on Summer of Hate as well.
Yes, we're one of the convening organizations.
I'm going to leave it there. Appreciate you coming on with me today.
Of course.
Folks, we've been talking with Liv Senghor, who works with Stop the Money Pipeline and Planet Over Profit, talking about climate campaigning and corporate campaigning in this new age of Trump. If you like what you're hearing, please check us out on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. If you're watching this on YouTube, hit that subscribe button. If you're listening to us on one of the many audio platforms we're on, give us a rate and review. And then if you really like us, check us out on greenandredpodcast.org and hit that support button, make a donation, or become a patron at patreon.com/greenredpodcast. And it's January 20th, folks, and it's no time like the present to make trouble and misbehave. And we will talk to you all again soon.